speak of the devil and he shall appear. Well, thanks for joining. I've been talking about you for like the last 10 minutes. So when you catch this on replay, you'll hear all that. Welcome to the show. We've got two pieces that we'll talk about. I mean, we can talk about whatever. I'm monitoring the chat. But the first piece is called, it's in the Financial Times. It's called, "It's Time for Europe's Magical Thinking on Defense to End." I love this piece, but apparently not everybody did. So I guess first of all, yeah, it was a short, tightly written piece. But what's the take that you had there? What's the gist?
So a lot of Europeans have the idea that their security, their continent's security, has been underpinned by the U.S. security guarantee for 75 some years.
Mm-hmm.
And so understandably, they're reluctant to see the United States back away from their security, which means they're reluctant to do a whole host of things that otherwise you might think that they should be doing, like taking more responsibility for their own defense and their collective defense. But I was able to put my historian skills to use here. And from my perspective, the last 35 years out of the 75 have been years in which the United States didn't really manifest a clear willingness to defend Europe. And there's a paradox here.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, the United States wanted to play the role of orchestrating European security, and it did. The United States remained the dominant military power in Europe and the dominant factor in European security decision-making. And it actively dissuaded Europeans from pursuing strategic autonomy, as some at various points over the last several decades wanted to do. And yet, in this time, even though people like to blame Europeans for being naive, for being from Venus, whereas Americans are from Mars or something, I'm forgetting the planets, doesn't matter. Americans subscribe to their own fantasy, in which they believe that the overwhelming unipolar dominance of the United States would surely deter all future attacks. So if you go back and you look at the debates over NATO expansion, NATO enlargement, as some would insist upon.
It's expansion. I don't know why this distinction matters.
I don't know. NATO got bigger, okay?
Yeah.
And it's quite clear that the thing that was not on senators' minds when they approved new countries joining NATO was whether the United States would in fact have to come to the defense of those countries, and whether, if it came down to it, the United States should do such a thing. It's especially true if you look at the 2003-2004 quote unquote Big Bang round of NATO enlargement, when 7 new countries were added into the alliance, including the 3 small and hard to defend Baltic states on Russia's western border. And so we're in this predicament now in which Europeans think that they depend on America's military protection. And they're trying to decide, how much do we compromise to try to get in the good enough graces of Donald Trump to keep the U.S. happy and in NATO and nominally committed to the defense of all these European countries. When, to a degree that's pretty hard for American foreign policymakers to talk about, but is nonetheless real, it is hardly clear that the United States would, in fact, come to the defense of, as President Biden has said, every inch of NATO territory if it came down to it. And I don't mean to, say that there wouldn't be any chance. Of course, there would be. In fact, I think the United States would probably do certain things to assist, but it's not clear at all whether the United States would, in fact, launch a full-on war with Russia to remove its forces from every inch of NATO territory. So I think what's happening is that,
well, especially under Trump, right? I mean, like, maybe there's a greater chance of it with a Biden administration or something, but like you can't say that this is an ironclad guarantee or something under Trump when he's like openly willing to like negotiate about it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, his administration was, as it was allowing NATO to bring in Montenegro and North Macedonia during his first term, Trump would then go on TV and go, "Why should we defend those countries?" This is sort of ridiculous. But even under Joe Biden, if anyone thinks it is clear what a Biden administration would do in the event of a Russian attack on Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, no, it is not clear. So, so I think what's happened is that on both sides of the Atlantic, policy elites overvalue the U.S. The supposed U.S. security guarantee, and the sort of thing to focus on is that at the end of the day, Europe has a greater interest in defending Europe than the United States does. We've been on a holiday from that reality for a long time. That is ending now. And we have a president of the United States who's openly musing about, maybe I won't come to the defense of a NATO country if they don't pay their supposed dues or something like that. So I think a lot of people understand, what ought to happen, which is Europe becoming capable and responsible for defending Europe, and the United States moving to a supporting role in the alliance. But there's a lot of interests that have built up to keep things the way they are, and also, perception in some countries in Europe that the U.S. security guarantee is really the most ironclad thing. And I'm very concerned about this with respect to Ukraine also, because I think it's clear that many Ukrainians, including in the government, see NATO membership as their key demand in a negotiated settlement. They think that's what's really going to provide security for Ukraine, and I understand why they might think that. They look at the map and they say, Russia's attacked us and not NATO countries, and why don't we deserve it? When all these other countries around us got in, and they're right. If it's a question of deservingness, then yes, sure. But unfortunately, not only is that not going to happen for them, but it shouldn't happen, because a U.S. security guarantee to Ukraine, if that means the U.S. going to war with Russian forces in the event of a reinvasion after the current war, would have a real problem in terms of credibility. And so ultimately, the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO rests on this faith that commitments on paper are the surest way to deter aggression. And that kind of brings us back to the kind of thinking that surrounded the League of Nations, which in a previous iteration of my career, I happen to be a historian of.
Yeah. So in the chat, Lord Friezon asks a question about whether the world looks like it's becoming more realist. I don't think that's exactly the right way to put it, but that's also like a sufficiently large question that I would, unless you have thoughts about it, I kind of want to bracket it off because I want to address that more profoundly, deeply at a later date. But Cameron Faridi asks, is NATO premised on a giant bluff? What do you say to that?
Don't know. I think the odds of it being a bluff would go up if, say, Ukraine were admitted in the context of the entire NATO alliance having declined to fight Russian forces over Ukraine since 2014, when Russian territorial aggression and annexation against Ukraine began. That would look more clearly like a bluff. I do think in the event of an attack on NATO members, the alliance would do something for sure. So in that sense, I don't think it's a bluff, but I think that there would be big differences among NATO countries as to how they would respond. And the United States, being the leading element in NATO and being such a question mark as to its willingness to lead a response, that's not healthy for the alliance.
Yeah, I had a segment last week where I basically described extended nuclear deterrence as a lie, in the sense that it's like inherently incredible, New York for Berlin or New York for Paris or whatever, like not believable. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't end up using nukes on Europe's behalf, like we could, but that would also be a fucking disaster that nobody would benefit from. So yeah, but
Yeah,
that's
not
at the nuclear
100%
level.
bluff, but it might be like a 75% bluff, and that might be enough, right, to have the effect that one wants. But boy, is it risky.
Yeah, not very credible at best. Van, did you see the foreign affairs piece with BBC Dad? BBC Dad. So I don't know if you guys, Buff Angelest or whatever, they you didn't see the last live stream. I think at the end of the episode, I did a segment about South Korean nukes, about specifically that essay. Obviously, South Korean nukes are bad, but I'll bracket that off for now. Steven, back to you. What is your sense of how much Europe has like self-consciously been free riding on the US versus some other explanation for the kind of like good faith infatuation with American power?
It depends on which Europe we're talking about.
We just got rated by the majority report. That's a ton of extra eyeballs on the stream.
Okay.
All right. Welcome, eyeballs.
I tend to think that, as I've suggested in that piece, we can make too much of the differences between Europe and the United States, and we can do too much blaming of one side or the other. The fact is that there was this symbiotic relationship throughout the post-Cold War period in which Washington wanted to suppress European defense initiative while periodically asking Europeans to spend more without taking away from U.S. control and influence through NATO. So like, why wouldn't the United States want that? So this is what both parties wanted. It suited interests on both sides. So rather than blame I get where the blame the Europeans thing comes from. I get where the blame the Americans thing comes from. And I think it is going to get out of this trap. It's going to take determined action from both sides, right? Like one of the things that the United States needs to do, if in fact it wants to shift some of the defense burden onto Europe, is to be willing to stop pushing U.S. arms sales to Europe, which keeps the Europeans locked into to the United States, which keeps them from developing their defense industrial base in a cooperative way, and that makes it harder to support the politics of somewhat higher defense spending in Europe. The EU sees this problem and it has some ambitious targets, but successive American administrations, very much including the first Trump administration, don't like that, and they really want to sell American. So if the Trump administration coming in or a successor to that, really wants to change this dynamic, fine. I think they need to realize that it's going to be it involves a give and take, a renegotiation of the transatlantic bargain, and that means Europe, getting that benefit.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that frustrates me about Europe, which you sort of get at in the piece, is like his win was predictable, not in the sense of the specific, 2024 election, it's a coin toss or whatever, but like the reality of American politics has been that half of it is MAGA. And so it's inevitable in a fucking democracy, even if you think America is a functioning democracy, which is contestable, then you know that this portion of the electorate gets power at some point. They inevitably come to power, right? Like, do European officials not get that? Like, it feels like they had 4 years to avoid getting caught with their pants down, like in 2017, and they just totally blew it. I mean,
So someone's going to write, totally, someone's going to write a good history some years into the future of Europe trying to react to the rise of Trump and MAGA. And it's going to be pretty baffling as to why it was like, it actually took it becoming clear that Trump was the front runner for the Republican nomination in 2024 for there to be a real shift in Europe in the direction that we're talking about in favor of strategic autonomy. Although again, it's still very incomplete and uncertain. But I think part of the issue is that we had a first Trump administration, and Trump, at the end of the day, was a de facto primacist. As I mentioned, NATO expanded on his watch. It did not contract. He, sent javelins to Ukraine. There was, Trump then going on TV and making noises in various directions. There's his, regular praise of Putin, etc. But it's been very possible for Europeans to tell themselves a story that, kind of disregard the bluster. At the end of the day, the United States is more than Donald Trump, and we don't really have to change. And indeed, Donald Trump, his main position on European security has been more burden sharing. In other words, the allies should pay more for America to protect them.
It's like rent seeking, yeah.
Correct. So the implication being the United States is still willing to provide the service. And in theory, Trump would be satisfied if only the Europeans hit some magical number of defense spending. But then there are reasons to doubt that actually he would ever really be satisfied, because there's another part of Trump's brain that's going, okay, maybe I leave troops around or I stay in NATO, but what if something actually bad happens? What would I do then? And then, you could get some lawyers to tell you that Article 5, the collective security commitment, actually doesn't specify what members of NATO should do in a contingency. And, it certainly doesn't say that the United States needs to do more than other countries in NATO. So I think if I were me, but if I were in Europe and I were looking at the totality of this evidence, even without Donald Trump ever becoming a major figure in American politics, but especially in light of that, I would say, I really don't want to be dependent on the United States being able and willing to be there to lead a defense of Europe against Russia if it comes to it. And because I can do that math, the Kremlin can do that math.
Yeah.
And that's not the best way to do European security.
Yeah, fair enough. Buff Angelist in the chat asks, Article 5 has only been used to invade Afghanistan, correct? Yeah, that's a pretty hot irony, since Afghanistan's not in Europe or part of NATO. But I digress. So interestingly, the Financial Times ran a sort of rejoinder rebuttal letter to the editor or whatever in response to your piece. It's from Ivo Daalder, who was a NATO ambassador. Notably, he's like a really hot, staunch Trump critic. He kind of like resents everything that Trump represents. But what did he have to say in his response to you?
I don't recall the word Trump appeering in his response.
Surprise!
Uh, so his main point was that one shouldn't question the credibility of the U.S. security commitment to Europe. That seems somewhat different from arguing that there is no question about the reliability of that commitment.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to read between the line, one might say that he thinks, a certain amount of puffing up the American willingness is required, but that's not what he said literally. So give him the benefit of the doubt. But his main piece of evidence came from a poll that he cited from his own organization, the Chicago Council, showing that large numbers of Americans, majorities favor the U.S. remaining in NATO and either maintaining or increasing its commitment to NATO. And sure, that's fine. But the point I was making, which I think he's talking past, is that, yes, the paradox of the situation is that the United States has wanted to be in NATO and be the leading element in NATO on condition that the belief was that that would mean that the United States would never actually have to fight as part of its obligations to the alliance. And so wanting to be in NATO in a condition of peacetime is one thing. Actually believing that it would be worth it to fight Russia over every country within NATO, and it would be a different question depending on which country might be attacked. That's quite another thing, right? And so I don't think that evidence tells us very much. I mean, we also know that the polling has shifted a lot in response to our domestic politics. So so many people who I talk to, and this is confirmed if you look at the dynamics of support for NATO over the last decade, they associate Trump with being against NATO. And if they don't like Trump, then that means they are more favorable towards NATO. These are not factors that actually consider the very sobering realities that we'd be confronted with if it meant going to war with Russia. I think what's more telling is that throughout the war in Ukraine, since February 2022, or since 2014, if you like, there's been a quite deep and wide consensus in the United States that the stakes are not worth the United States going to war with Russia for. Joe Biden took the use of force off the table, even as he saw the invasion coming, even before it happened. And that was one of the least controversial elements of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Ukraine in these years. So then you say, yes, it would be different, of course, if we're talking about a contingency in the Baltic states. But how different? Once people start focusing on, okay, Article 5 says this, you might end up in a quite similar circumstance in which the United States is supplying, but not directly fighting, or it's fighting but trying to establish strict limits on the ways in which the conflict escalates.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen literally like MAGA accounts on social media. One of the big things they've been sharing in reference, like the past week or so, in reference to Biden's $1.25 billion aid package to Ukraine, is they would gesture at that, like, $1.25 billion for Ukraine. And then they would cut to this video of like literally the visceral experience of like record poverty in America. the like homeless people on the streets suffering and all this stuff. Just like it's there's a stylized element to what they're doing, and they're doing it from a like highly partisanized propaganda perspective. But what does it say that it's such low-hanging fruit? The argument sells itself. Like arguing against that is very tough. And I think it's fucked that like Ivo Daalder is hanging his hat on a public opinion poll when the public voted for the guy who was the biggest NATO skeptic of all. You know,
Right.
like how much does that really matter if they chose the guy, you know? Fuck. Yeah. So here we go. Hail Geode. As a devil's advocate, why shouldn't European leaders just appease Trump? Just pay him more money, you know? I think there's not a lot of security in that, but let's say when a path of least resistance, probably.
Yeah, definitely the path of least resistance. Yeah, I think they're tempted to do that. You know, the problem is that the problem that we've just talked about doesn't get solved. And in fact, what happens is Europe is spending more on defense anyway. I mean, Europe is now spending a decent amount on defense. And if you put together what Europe spends collectively, you know, it's far more than Russia, at least, you know, once the war in Ukraine ends.
Mm-hmm.
So Europe already has, you know, vast financial and demographic advantages over Russia. Of course, you have to discount some of that advantage because of the collective action problem, because we're dealing with a lot of different countries in Europe. So, you know, Europe's going to be paying quite a bit for defense. It's going to be buying American to appease Trump. Trump is also probably going to turn the screws more on Europe in terms of trade, and not just with the United States, but also with China. So the costs of this relationship are going up for Europe. And then they get an unreliable security guarantee, which they're still dependent on. And their fear may be, you know, the more that Europe makes the United States dispensable or redundant, you know, the more the United States can then walk away. But I get that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I think that's better than the I think that, you know, the reality is the United States is not that reliable now or in the future. And it's probably more likely that they'll keep the United States happy with European security if Europe is actually making the United States increasingly redundant. And realistically, it's going to take quite some time to do a transition in a responsible way for Europe to acquire all the things that they would like to.
Yeah, Peacefire now in the chat. Great streamer. He says, do you believe Trump will further accelerate the growth of BRICS? BRICS is expanding this year regardless, but maybe that part of that is reading larger tea leaves. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think BRICS is the challenge for BRICS. They've been doing a lot of expansion, and it is, I think, you know, more is not always better. It may make it harder to develop alternative payment systems to the US dollar, for example, or alternative currencies.
Yeah.
So I'm not, you know, depends how BRICS countries see their own interests. I'm not sure that Trump will prove to be like a determining factor in this equation. So we'll see. But, you know, in terms of doing things like replacing the US dollar, that is so far away that, you know, even irresponsible policies by the United States are not going to kind of result in some flight from the dollar immediately, because there's still, you have to have an alternative that's ready for the dollar to be replaced. Now, I say that maybe something horrible happens, but the U.S. can be quite draconian with the use of sanctions, as we've seen. That's not a Trump-only phenomenon. And yes, it does give countries reasons to want to work together to get around that, but it's proven to be extremely difficult.
Yeah, yeah. The thing, so I saw a stat that it was like only 58% or 52% of global transactions are actually denominated in US dollars now. So the percentage of transactions is declining. People are using other currencies. But like you said, there's not a stock alternative when the world gets volatile. People, capital runs to America, and the dollar is the safe asset still, and so the irony of like Trump making the world more volatile is that it's still, people want to put the US dollars in, or put their money into US dollars. And so that reinforces the dollar in a sense, but it's also going to reinforce the imperative for like BRICS nations, if they're the subject of these like crazy tariff schemes, to like strategize about how to get to an alternative. So it's like, in a large, big, structural, long-term sense, we're sort of moving away from dollar primacy very gradually in a naturalistic kind of way. But if we do crazy stuff and we impose tariffs on 40% of the world, then like that might accelerate things,
At some point, there's a breaking point.
Yeah.
But this is where like I put my historian hats on, and I feel like we're very, very close to this problem right now, and I'm not sure like what is the action or series of actions that could lead to a tipping point and really move us to some different situation. Maybe Bitcoin, maybe that becomes the replacement, and Trump could have something to do with that.
There is a geopolitics of crypto waiting to be written about. I might have to think about that.
I don't want to read that.
I went to the mall in New Zealand, like where I live. The fucking mall has a station where you can buy crypto. I was like, this has gone too far. So we talked about Europe. You have this other piece in Global Asia magazine. Asia should encourage Trump, the peacemaker. What was the gist of this piece? Well, you said it in the title, maybe, but
so because I was writing in a forum that wasn't for Americans or Europeans to read, I tried to think about what would I want an Asian audience to hear, and my premise is that a lot remains undecided in Donald Trump's mind. We don't know how his administration is going to shake out, and there's going to be a lot of people in the administration who have very different views on what the U.S. role in the world should be, and how the U.S. should relate to countries in Asia. And in Trump's first term, he often listened to foreign leaders and followed some of their advice, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And so, I think Donald Trump could well make things worse. But I'm not making any predictions here when I talk about Trump, the peacemaker, in quotes.
Yeah.
But clearly, the persona of a deal maker and a peacemaker, these are parts of Trump's self-image. He wants to be a peacemaker, I think. Doesn't mean he will. And we saw some manifestations of that, especially in his diplomacy toward North Korea. First term. We also see that in this campaign, he warned a lot about what he called the growing dangers of World War III with Russia or China. He talked in his victory speech on election night about, we're not going to start wars, we're going to end wars. So I think that's what he wants. He wants to be a deal maker and a peacemaker for his legacy. And I think he'll probably have more advisors in the administration this time than he did last time who would encourage him in that direction. And so my plea to U.S. allies and partners and others in Asia would be to try to encourage Trump's better instincts rather than his worst ones. And I think there's basically three things I think on the table that are possible. Again, not saying that they're likely, but possible with the second Trump administration. So first of all is an effort to broker an end to the war in Ukraine and to pivot the U.S. away from European and maybe Middle East security, but I'm not sure how confident I am that that's even going to be a possibility in this administration. We shall see. Anyway, I digress. At least Europe, right? That is a possibility. And many U.S. Allies and partners in Asia have often, during the Biden administration, certainly tried to discourage that kind of thing. So I urge them to rethink that, because I think it would benefit Asia as a region, as well as the United States, if the U.S. were able to adopt more of a focus on security in Asia and do less in the Middle East and Europe. And then in Asia itself, diplomacy with North Korea becomes more of a possibility, I think, over the next 4 years than it has been in the last 4 years. Subject more than I do about, but something that I hope that the administration would take seriously, and the next leader of South Korea, or the next party to take power. It's a fluid situation.
Yes.
Should think about whether there was whether there's potential to get back to the kind of diplomacy that broke down after the Hanoi summit in 2019. And then even with respect to China, even though the main legacy of the first Trump administration on foreign policy was to lead the foreign policy establishment, to lead Washington toward a more competitive and confrontational posture towards China, Trump himself has always had a more ambivalent stance. He's been more interested in making deals on military and geopolitical issues with China, even as he's wanted to be very competitive with respect to trade. And so I think, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Trump could, issue assurances over Taiwan that would help lower the tensions over the Taiwan issue, which is by far the issue that would be most likely to bring the United States and China into a war, indeed World War III. It's something that isn't beyond Trump. If it's something that, that the Chinese leadership would find meaningful, and I suspect that they might, it's something that could meaningfully reduce the risk of war and get us to maybe a more stable place in the relationship over time.
Yeah, like you can question, by the way, you're experiencing with me the fluidity of how like hilarious chats come in, and you're trying to have like a reasoned intellectual policy conversation, and then somebody says something hilarious and it's like you got to address it. But anyway, yeah, like you can question Trump's capacity to understand cause and effect in the world, and like clearly he doesn't grasp that. And so there are consequences that follow from his actions that like surely he does not anticipate. But he does recognize that like World War III is an object to stay away from. He doesn't want to be associated with that. Like it's the Project 2025 of foreign policy, World War III, like stay away, I disavow it kind of thing. That doesn't mean that it won't come to pass.
Right.
But there's something that we can work with, that these flags are planted in his mind,
So Trump has his own right-wing straw man gloss on the value of diplomacy it's easy to miss if you don't share his larger worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But he often talks about how like it's tough to sit down with these dictators and talk about things. And sad to say, in a way, he presented a more pro-diplomacy view than the Democratic alternative in this campaign. I recall Kamala Harris in the debate with Trump talking about how like Trump had sullied like the hollowed ground of Camp David by inviting the Taliban there to do diplomacy, as if diplomacy is things that we do only with virtuous people.
You make peace with your enemies, not with your friends, you know?
Yeah, and I do think Trump gets that. And doesn't necessarily see, and we saw shades of this in his handling of Kim Jong-un in his first term,
Mm-hmm.
Gets the idea that to some extent he should show respect to another power, and not try to denigrate them and use language that is provocative toward them. Obviously, there are other faces of Trump that are countervailing. So I don't want to misunderstand this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that there is something there that is not to be ignored, and that does create the possibilities that we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but it just popped in my head. Like, if you have an abusive father, but who also cracks jokes, like you want him to be in joke cracking mode, not in belt whooping mode, you know? And so, like, even if that's the ridiculous, absurd logic of the situation that you're working within, you kind of have to acknowledge that logic and still work with it anyway, you know?
Yeah. And this is
So,
where we get to like, it's important how people who don't like Trump
mm-hmm.
respond to his foreign policy. We have choices to make. And in the first Trump administration, most of the Democratic Party, at least the political leadership, responded to Trump's foreign policy by saying, yeah, this guy's like a maniac wannabe dictator and in such small portions. He wants to pull troops out of Syria. He wants to have a diplomatic summit with North Korea. Reward the dictator with a meeting with the president of the United States, who, by the way, is Donald Trump. So
he wants troops out of Japan. Yeah.
So it's really important that Democrats, recognize that the Biden administration's foreign policy had flaws, both in substance and as a matter of politics.
Mm-hmm.
That these are real issues, and Trump is going to be the president for the next 4 years. And there's going to be, if you're like, my main worry is that Trump will be too much of a primacist, and we could get into a conflict that is not a desired conflict, like we almost did with Iran when Soleimani was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think there's going to be like a shortage of things for Democrats to be concerned about and object to in our foreign policy in the next 4 years. But I'm hoping that they will respond to Trump in a way that is productive, of good policy, both in this administration and for a future Democratic administration. I actually thought, I don't know I'm curious to see what your perceptions of this were. I thought that over the course of the first Trump administration, the Democrats' line began as a defense of orthodoxy and primacy, but got better over time. I thought that the Democrats' primary debates in 2020 on foreign policy were quite good. So I thought there was learning. And then things have gotten worse. And in this campaign, the Democrats, I don't need to belabor this, but they were criticizing Trump for being, not tough enough on Iran, all sorts of things that they never would have said in the 2020 campaign, which, by the way, the Democrats happen to have won, unlike the other ones.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I mean, in the chat, Sauvignon Blanc said, where was it? I just lost it. Trump has managed Dove clout largely because the Democratic Party sort of abandoned the field. And I think that the essence of that is right. Like sometime between 2018 and 2020, the Democratic Party leadership made this weird strategic decision, which I guess in the context of freaking out about Trump fascism makes sense. But like they made the decision to like treat national security civil servants and people with backgrounds in the CIA and shit as the people to run in congressional elections, as like the national security credential. Agents of the national security state were like the best candidates that we could find for the Democratic Party. And there are like isolated cases where that's like narrowly true because of a particular district, but like in general that's fucked from like a principled perspective. Like you couldn't have a greater repudiation of peace and opposition to war, which is like such a huge part of like the original grassroots of the Democratic Party from the Cold War. Like I don't know, that seems problematic to me. And like the fact that we did that is what Trump is responding to. He's like, oh, nobody's claiming to be opposed to World War III. We've got the Democrats trying to out hawk us.
Yeah. I think for many Democrats, especially professional Democrats in the national security space, Trump seemed to open up this tantalizing opportunity to shake the Democrats' reputation for being weak on national security. They thought they could seize this high ground, and then you end up campaigning with Liz Cheney, right? Not so much because of foreign policy, but it wasn't like the Democrats distanced themselves from her foreign policy views either.
Yeah.
During that campaign. And I think
most lethal military, that was the promise.
Most lethal military. I think one of the things that they missed was that Trump actually has his own ways of conveying strength that are not the same as taking orthodox, hawkish foreign policy positions. Mm-hmm. And frankly, Obama did some of this too, right? Remember his 2008 campaign. First of all, he never would have been the nominee had he not opposed the war in Iraq.
That was the only thing on his platform, really, like to differentiate himself.
That was the main policy issue. But he also, said in that campaign that if we have intelligence that Osama Bin Laden is in Pakistan, and we don't think that the government of Pakistan will deal with it, then we will violate the sovereignty of Pakistan to get Bin Laden. And when I heard that, I went, whoa, okay. This guy's wants to be president because he's identified, look, Bin Laden is an actual enemy of the United States, right? Saddam Hussein, not.
Right.
But Bin Laden, yes. And we actually did need to get Bin Laden to have a chance of moving on, though we didn't take up that chance very well, but that's another story. That showed a certain steeliness and a seriousness about, upholding the national security of the United States, which call me crazy. I know I'm a radical. I happen to think is an important thing. So quality you want in a president. Well, Trump conveys strength in some similar ways, right? Not afraid to make a deal with enemies. Of course, that was an Obama thing, right? He would meet with Iran without preconditions. He and Hillary had this whole thing about, preconditions. And he's just like, it's stupid. If we think we could get something that's in our interest, what is this crap about preconditions? So now it's sort of Trump who's taken up that more pro-diplomacy, deal-making, persona, also showing that, our interests aren't the same as our allies. Trump does it in ways that are more disparaging of allies than I would have it. But he shows that there is a difference. Whereas under the Biden administration, the U.S. wanted to look like it was totally in lockstep with allied governments, which doesn't work very well when we're locked into conflicts with no apparent endgame.
I can't remember who said it in the chat, but maybe it was Buffangelist. But earlier there was a question about NATO in the Pacific, or like basically NATO doing great power competition with China, which I obviously have opinions about. But like, what do you think about that?
No.
Same. Okay.
No thanks. Ridiculous. It's like mostly it amounts to like, will NATO open an office, like rent a building in Tokyo?
This is the thing. What is their capacity outside of their own region? It's fucking titular. It's symbolic.
It's a strange thing. So you sound weird if you say, I don't want help, dealing with issues in Asia from Europeans. So I mean, I guess maybe, but here's the actual problem, right? The United States is militarily overcommitted and overstretched. And there's sort of one clear solution to this, which is a division of labor in the transatlantic alliance. Europe defends Europe. The United States is less on the hook for that. And with the amount of resources and attention that it can devote to these foreign policy problems, it focuses on Asia. Okay, like that's the answer. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen over the Biden administration is this attempt to the phrase du jour was connective tissue among allies in both regions, and then try to make us like stop thinking about this problem of overcommitment and overstretch. That doesn't really solve any problems. In addition to which, the image of NATO coming into the Asia Pacific,
it's white people. We can just say that. It's
right. So there's problems there. It's like, is that even optically worth it? I think not.
Yes, there's a epidermal problem. Yeah.
Well, also look, I mean, the narrative that NATO expansion has something to do with the war in Ukraine is popular around the world, including in Asia, right?
Yeah.
In China, popular. So then, even symbolically, bringing NATO to Asia, plays into that whole narrative and those insecurities. Don't.
There's more to be said about this. Like, to me, it's like it's all downside. I mean, there's really not upside at all for NATO being involved in Asia, and like not least which because like U.S. policy now does deliberately try to encircle China strategically. Like for a long time, China would claim that and decry it, but it wasn't our self-conscious decision that we're trying to strategically encircle them. Now, as a matter of policy, that we have been doing that for the past like almost 10 years. And the idea that you're going to do more confirmation bias of that by bringing in these Europeans, that where does that get you? Like that only accelerates the confrontation, justifies everything China does.
I will say that, European governments telling China what the consequences might be if China were to invade Taiwan in terms of mainly economic relations, that's something that I'd like the Europeans to do. That could help with the deterrence problem. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a huge part of it, but it can help. But that can be done on on a basis that has nothing to do with like NATO having infrastructure or offices in the Asia Pacific. Having said that, I don't know, maybe it's like a really nice office in Tokyo with like an excellent latte machine or something. And if I were there, I would be saying, man, this is good coffee.
Nothing deters like a good espresso. Yeah. So, okay, one last question and then I'll let you go. Kurt Asian earlier up in the chat, who was my videographer on a documentary I once made, he asked what you thought about the prospects of Trump actually defending Taiwan against an invasion of China. So I guess you have to assume that like the invasion happens, but like the defense commitment to Taiwan.
Right. Well, I very much hope that the invasion won't happen. You know, Trump, we have empirical evidence of Trump questioning why the United States should defend Taiwan, questioning why Taiwan would be able to prevail, given its size and proximity to China in a conflict with China. That said, you know, I think it's just a situation of radical uncertainty for any US president, Trump included. One of the things that worries me is that imagine you're the president, you're in the Oval Office, you see China preparing to invade Taiwan. So that invasion begins, the global economy is gonna tank. Your presidency is pretty well screwed. Now, so you could do nothing. And what do you have? You have, I'm the president who allowed an economic meltdown and failed to stand up to China and quote unquote lost Taiwan, right? Politically, you'd be blamed for losing Taiwan. At least you might well be blamed for that. We have plenty of precedents of presidents being blamed for those kinds of things in previous decades, as well as presidents fearing that they would be blamed. Like LBJ, one of the reasons he escalated in Vietnam. So, if I fight China, well, maybe it's a bad idea. Maybe it's not warranted based on our own interests. Maybe it's a huge risk and a disaster, but just maybe I end up as the next FDR and I win the war. And, I've salvaged my presidency. So you have a kind of like near certainty of a failed presidency versus some chance of a good presidency. So I worry about the politics, right? And I worry that our country is not prepared to understand the costs of a war with China. I have a piece coming out soon with Jennifer Kavanaugh, and what we basically talk about is that the United States ought to be giving itself another option than that dangerous binary of basically do nothing and let Taiwan fall versus World War III with China. And it would take Taiwan doing some things differently to be able to impede a Chinese invasion. It might involve the United States being able to use uncrewed systems to resupply Taiwan from the eastern side of the island and make the conflict really long and costly for China and pave the way for a diplomatic settlement. That is I think, plausible in-between option that could allow us to keep out of war, which I really think would be a disaster. And so maybe, Trump could find his way into that kind of a third scenario, although I'm not sure that like Taiwan in the next 4 years would be capable of holding off the Chinese. But you never know with conflicts like this. Look at the way Ukraine has unfolded.
Yeah. Whenever that comes out, let me know, because I've been spending far too much of my life thinking about China war scenario stuff, and there have been no good options really. There are third way possibilities, but like they haven't gotten any traction. So like the more people spend time thinking through that, it would be very useful. In the meantime, let's make some peace, establish a new détente with China. And I don't know if you saw this. You blurbed the book. Thank you very much. So
very welcome. I meant every word. I forgot what I wrote, but I know that I was
too.
sincere.
Well, actually, I can read it right here, but yeah, I'll read it later. All right, man. Well, I've taken up enough of your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Chat, everybody, stick around. I'm going to continue the episode. But Stephen, thanks for coming by, man. This is great.
Awesome. Really enjoyed it. And thanks for everybody who chimed in.
All right.